Hello and welcome to the lecture on the follow-up to the War of 1812, sort of looking at the meaning of the War of 1812. What was it all about? Sort of what were the effects? What kind of country emerged out of the War of 1812? And we'll start with a quote from Henry Adams, who's the great-grandson of John Adams, speaking much later, saying, many nations have gone to war in pure gaiety of heart, but perhaps the United States were the first to force themselves into a war that they did not want, that they dreaded, in the hope that the war itself might create a spirit they lacked. And it most certainly did. It created a spirit of nationalism and coming together as a single country. You can't really be a nation until you have a shared history. And so this is the country really starting to have that kind of shared history. And, quote there from Albert Gallatin at the time, just talking about the national spirit that certainly came about with it. Okay, so the war ended with the Treaty of Ghent, and it really didn't settle anything. There were no changes at all to the relationship between Britain and the United States. You look at things like impressment, that didn't end. That's not really ending at this time. And the treaty is really a reality from both sides that it's a stalemate, that neither side was able to achieve a victory. For Britain, this war, the War of 1812, is really a side note to much larger issues going on in Europe with Napoleon, which are ending at around the same time. And we've got with the Hartford Convention, this was a meeting of people who'd been opposed to the war, mostly Federalists in the Northeast, which was the worst affected economically and sort of just physically by the war, the region of the country that was least favorable to going to war. And so they met to really hammer out their grievances that they had with the national government. And there was talk of secession meaning leaving the United States, going independent. That's the most radical of the people. Most of them are really just talking about minor changes that they would like to see happen to the national government, in particular ending the 3/5 clause, because look at all the presidents we've had, Washington and Jefferson and Madison, all winning in large part because of the 3/5 clause and this Virginia dynasty. The New England's really looking to end that. And so they put out the proposals right at the same time the war comes to an end, and with a big victory for Andrew Jackson in New Orleans. So it was just horrible timing that this sort of unpatriotic kind of talk was meeting with this such pride at the same time, and it really hammered the nail in the coffin of the Federalist Party. They are really done as a political party. So, that's going to get into some of the effects of the War of 1812, and that is really the first one. It's the death of the Federalist Party. And we're going to enter into a period of time from about 1816 to 1824 known as the era of good feelings, meaning that there's no political fighting during this time, and there's really just the one political party, the Jefferson Party, the Republicans. And new respect from others towards America. Britain and Europe sort of grudgingly respecting that, the United States is here, they're here to stay, and, they are a real nation, and really the only republic at this time. That the nationalism. War heroes that will catapult themselves into the presidency in later times. Andrew Jackson, one of the most infamous of all presidents, and we'll get to him in good time. He's the only president who's got a time period named after him, the age of Jackson, and he'll be coming very much into the limelight for the next little while. William Henry Harrison, another one. Natives, their ability to play one power off against another is gone, and that long and slow decline continues, and will be sort of speeding up after this. Manufacturing got a real big boost in the Northeast. This is a time of early machines like the cotton machines, the spinning jenny, and so on. Because of the war, it sort of forced American manufacturers to, gave them the opportunity to produce themselves without having to compete with British manufactured goods, and sort of gave them a little bit of a boost to this early American industry, particularly in the Northeast. Border agreements are going to come up with Canada, Spain as well, and this is them sort of asserting themselves this way. And they're going to acquire Florida this time. Long term, it's going to open up the floodgates to Western expansion. 100 years of isolation from European affairs, same with 100 years of relative peace in Europe as well. And American culture really starts to come out at this time. Romanticism, that we'll look at more in more detail in future lectures. But yeah, we're starting to get American popular culture coming out. and beginnings of a national economy. We'll get to that pretty soon too. Now, this is also, entering into this period of time that we're going to call the antebellum, or before the Civil War period, 1815 to 1860, a time of growing respect, much more sort of feelings of pride in the country, and the serious westward expansion, development of manufacturing in the United States, small industry as well, and yes, the death of the Federalist Party. So let's just take it and look at some of the ways that they were able to assert themselves a little bit more as a real power now. They're not a first-rate power, not a superpower that they will become, in later times. But they're not a laughing stock anymore, and so they've stepped up a little bit. They've graduated out of kindergarten, so to speak, and they're able to come into some agreements with Canada over sharing the fisheries off of Newfoundland, settling border disputes, and over on the west coast, agreeing with Britain and Canada that the Oregon Territory will be shared for now. And when we say Canada, Canada is not an independent country at this time. They're still a colony of of Great Britain. Now, Florida, the Spanish Empire in the Americas is starting to fall apart as Mexico and South American countries declare and win their independence. So within this context, they're able to negotiate and purchase Florida from Spain. General Jackson, Andrew Jackson, will sort of lead a group in there to put down any resistance, especially native resistance, and they get a deal done. So this is what's happening in South America. This is showing the years that all of these nations were gaining their independence, with Argentina and Chile very early on, and a little bit later some of them like Brazil, and Mexico also around this time as well. And so we can see we got some changes to the map with Spain, and then later Mexico. They hammer out an agreement showing this line here. That'll be the border between the two nations. Up here is Oregon Territory. It's shared between the Great Britain and the United States, and they're in Florida, which they get down there. And another way to sort of look at the map. We've also got Russia up there, and laying claim as well to this territory. Which brings us to the final sort of asserting of their new sort of role within world affairs, what's known as the Monroe Doctrine, named after President Monroe, which was a declaration to the powers of Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. That this is America's domain, it's America's sort of backyard. America will deal with any issues. And it's born out of concern that these newly independent countries in South America will be preyed upon by the French or by the Russians, or Spain may be coming back. And so it's America, with Britain sort of looking over the shoulders, also agreeing to this idea of saying to the European powers to stay out. Now Britain, they want their goal of being able to not create their own colonies, but having a market in the Americas. And this kind of asserting to the European powers is going to be sort of a dominant theme in American foreign policy right up to today as well. And if you look at something like the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 1960s, that was an affront to this whole notion of saying to European powers of staying out. All right, thank you very much. That concludes this lecture.